Hello, wine lovers, Trophy Wine Hunter. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm really excited to bring you part one in my review of the 2022 release at BC Liquor Stores of the Bordeaux vintage. This is the 40th anniversary of Bordeaux releases in BC Liquor Stores, and as an added bonus this year, they brought in some 1982 wines also that are from the chateau, and that's very exciting. Of course, they will be quite pricey, but you'll get perfect provenance. I'm really excited to do this video because this is one of, I think in all of the years I've done these videos for this YouTube channel, this is the most interesting year to talk about. If you recall, going back to the release of the 2022 vintage, the release price on that campaign was very high. It came off the 2021 vintage. We were just coming out of COVID and prices were very, very high. This was also the first year that critics went back to Bordeaux. For the previous 1920 and 21 vintages, they had done a lot of things online, so they were finally invited back to Bordeaux. So there was a lot of excitement, and it would be a perfect story if they got this Marvel vintage. And I'm one of the few people, I think, that had set out. A lot of people had compared this vintage to 1982. If you look at all the wine critics out there and YouTubers, all say this is a magnificent vintage. I was the only one, and you can see my videos when the release said, I'm not certain about this. And I'll tell you why, and I'm still not certain about this vintage. I think it's a very dangerous vintage for consumers because if you buy like just across the board, it's very dangerous. There are some wines that I think will not last long term, and I'll tell you my reasons why, but it's the whole spin on things. And you can see already, I said this was going to happen. People were going to give out great scores. The commercial aspect of this was the first vintage back for all the wine critics. And so if you rate the first vintage back not great, you're probably not going to be invited back. Secondly, they've had some really tough times in Bordeaux, and so they needed something. And if you remember that vintage, there was a ton of press on the 2022 Entrepreneur release, more so than I've ever seen, and multiple kind of articles on it because it was selling so terribly. It was overpriced for what it was. It was like a 20% markup from 2021, and they were lauding it as this huge vintage. And it's one of these miracle vintages because they couldn't explain it. So let's go through this. So 2021, the weather, wet in December. It was a cool and mild spring that delayed the bud blossoming. April had some frost. May to June was great, but then June had some rain. There was 2 heat waves, one in late June, one in late August. There was no rain from June to about September. Very minimal rain. That doesn't sound like a perfect vintage to me. That doesn't sound like 82 to me. That doesn't sound like 9 or 10 to me. There was very high alcohol in some of the regions too, because there was a lot of high yields. So all of this information doesn't sound on paper to be a great vintage. This sounds like a spotty vintage. But somehow when the wines came out, everyone was saying they were magnificent. And I think what it is that there was a spin on it. There is also a component of our palates changing. So if you're expecting the 1982 vintage, another hot vintage like 03, 09, 10, that's not this vintage. It's very accessible, very early, and you have to change your mindset. This is not your prototypical Bordeaux release where you drink the wines and they're all tannic and stuff like that. That's not this vintage. So what I'm trying to figure out is whether this is the new norm or this is just an outlier that was used to sell a vintage. Because you're seeing that already. People were saying it was a miracle vintage, it's the best vintage to 1945. People are starting to step back on that. They're now saying, well, it's a different vintage. This is the new age of Bordeaux. We're doing things differently. And that's what I expected. And I think it will continue. And if I am correct, and I could be totally wrong, I think this will be a decent vintage, which have some great wines, but will have some spotty wines, and be and will that won't last long term. And there is some herbaceousness in and greenness in some of the wines, and that will cause some of the wines will be overpriced in the long term. Some of them are magnificent. A lot of assistance of nature in this vintage. So they did a lot of things they didn't do normally. And I guess the explanation was we have to do things now because it's getting hotter in Bordeaux, so we're doing more. So this whole idea of terroir, we're going to let the terroir speak, we're going to let nature speak, is basically thrown out the window for 2022. They did a lot. The grapes. First thing they did, a lot of wineries did whole bunch fermentation, which is normal, I think, in Burgundy, but not so normal in Bordeaux. That supposedly gives it more vibrancy and freshness because they were worried about the acidity. It also helps to reduce the alcohol because they were doing that. What that effect has on the wine, we're not sure because they haven't done that before very much in Bordeaux. And so what I think it does is I think it also, because there's always a give and take, I think it also gives up some of the intensity of flavors in the wines, which I did taste, and some herb notes and greenness, which is not usual, not typical for a hot vintage in Bordeaux to have herb aromas and spice tastes. That's not normal. But that could be the new normal. There was some, I think, very small, but probably the lower end wineries probably did add some tartaric acid to get up the acidity. They reduced oak, and that's again oak influence, and again that's again not to cover up the different flavors. They picked really early because they weren't sure what it was going to do, how they were getting ripe, and they were worried, I guess, about getting too much ripeness in the and getting a flabby wines. But that's not what I've experienced. So you would think the Merlot grape and the Rape Bank probably is not a great vintage for this. They were picked quite early, and they might have got as much ripeness as they would want it to. So it's actually a vintage that you really have to be careful of, and you have to look at each winery. So you really even can't look at regions. The only generalization I would make is that probably the left bank did a little bit better than the right bank, and more cab in a wine will probably be better than more Merlot. As an example, Chateau Margaux, I think, used 93% of their blend this year as Cabernet Sauvignon. That's very, very high for them. And so that's kind of the trend. If you see people using more Cabernet Sauvignon than normal, I think that's a good thing. Other general tasting notes, we tasted about 13 or 14 different wines from the 2022 vintage from different regions. I found all of them quite drinkable. So much more so than previous vintages. Normally, when we drink New Bordeaux, it's very either acidic or very tannic or both. Of the wines that I drank, I think maybe 30% to me were very tannic. There were a little bit more that were acidic. But it was really kind of each wine was a little different. So it's very hard in this vintage to kind of make generalizations, say, oh, this region is better than this one. I would think if you're going to bank on a region, it'd probably be Saint Julien. I think it did quite well because it is cab dominant, and I just think most of the wineries there probably did a very good job. The wines are very accessible, which is unusual, but that doesn't mean that's bad. What I'm concerned about is the long-term ageability of these wines. So there's three things that I think I'm concerned about. The acidity in the wines that I tasted, I thought the acidity wasn't low. On paper, a lot of these wines are low in terms of acidity. So they've done something to balance it out very well. That wise, I don't see the tannin structure to be excessive on a lot of wines. And I think that's probably what they did. They probably dialed back the tannin, dialed back the oak to kind of go in line with the acidity. I think the only problem is with some of these wines, I did find the intensity of flavor much lighter than what I would expect for a new release Bordeaux vintage. That means they're very drinkable right now, but I do have some concerns about long-term ageability. So when I go through the wines that I'm choosing, that's what I'm looking at. Long-term ageability. Most of these wines actually are drinking quite nicely right now and will drink nicely short-term, 5 years. I think there'll be magnificent wines for the first 5 years. It's the time after that, how they will be. And I believe that this will not be like a 1982 vintage where all the wines will be great after 5 years. I think it will be spotty. And I think the ones that will do well who are the people that have money and technology who have done a lot to the wine, like whole cluster fermentation, that have been able to dial back oak, that and have been able to, through technology, pick riper grapes. I think it's funny because in a hot vintage, ripeness should not be a problem, but I think because it was complicated by the low acidity and the extenuating climate features, namely some frost, some heat waves, it created a very unusual system and not a very usual year. So, and right now, winemakers still can't explain why there's freshness in these wines when the acidity is so low. No one actually knows. But at least from my tasting, I do find that acidity is not a problem. I don't feel many wines are flabby. In fact, I find the tannin level for a lot of them being the problem because I think they're not tannic enough for long term. And I find the intensity of flavor is a little bit light. I'm sure this is going to be pretty controversial and a lot of people will have their views, but all I can tell you is what I taste. And this is kind of what I expected to happen because um, I just don't see it in terms of the actual climate, how this happens. And I think even if they taste very nice right now, it's a vintage or a use of um, systems that we haven't seen often before. So we just don't know what the long term effect is. But maybe they made some tremendous wines. Definitely, it cannot be compared to 82 or 9 or 10. They were totally different vintages. We haven't had a vintage like this before. And I think, again, this makes it a very interesting vintage, which I would proceed with caution. I would not overpay for wines on this vintage. Just you might be really good, but you're taking a bit of a gamble, in my opinion, just because I think that this is a kind of stylistically a vintage that's we haven't seen before, and winemakers are doing things that we haven't seen before. So we don't have the benefit of history. Um, it's very clear that how they make wines in 1982 or 2003 is not how they make wines now. Everyone said that, if this was a normal vintage and we had done this with 2003 kind of technology and our thinking in 2003, we would have high tannin wines, very dry, and lots of kind of alcohol, very fruit forward, that type of wine, and somewhat flabby. So they've tried to make it a little bit fresher and more balanced. How that affects the wine long term, we just don't know. We just can't tell because, again, they're using different techniques, they're using different philosophy as compared to older vintages. I hope this video has been useful, and I look forward to discussions with my subscribers and comment section. I'm gonna sure I get it a lot. I think my view is a little bit pretty unique, but I yeah, based on my tasting, I can only tell you how I taste wines. This is definitely a different vintage, and definitely I would proceed with a lot of caution on this. Do your research on this vintage. Make sure that you kind of, and if possible, drink the wines. I know that BC liquor stores will have tastings. Taste them yourself. And if you are looking for short-term drinking, a lot of these wines are going to be great in the short term. If you're looking for long-term, pay attention to three things. The tannin level should be high, acidity level should be high, and most importantly, the fruit content has to be quite high. And if any of those are out of balance, perhaps that will, for that wine, might have some long-term problems. I find a lot of the wines, again, very drinkable right now, but that concerns me a little bit, that they are drinking that early. Now, if you talk to the Bordelais, they will say, this is our new style. We can do freshness. We can get freshness right up front. They can drink well now and they can drink well 20 years from now. I'm not that convinced that can happen, and that is because we've never seen that before. Could they could be right, but I'm kind of a person that likes to go by odds, and I will take the odds that something that hasn't happened in the past is not going to happen in the future. But that's the whole basis of ratings. We always base it on what other vintages did and how they reacted. And now all of a sudden in 2022, we're going to change that whole order, and we're going to say, no, we're not going to do that anymore. We're just going to base it on now. And if we can't explain something, we just taste and just kind of close our eyes. I'm not certain I buy that totally, and I could be totally wrong, but that's my job, as a YouTube wine commentator, to kind of tell you what I think, not what people want to spin to consumers. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Until next time, happy drinking.